Hey there everybody, it's Mark Curley. I'm back with another video. This is the fourth and final video in my series of no time-lapse vids, in which I'm showing the entire process of creating this illustration, start to finish, without any time-lapse at all. Old man time-lapse is on vacation, living it up at Disneyland. Maybe you went to Galaxy's Edge. Who knows? But in any case, I am going to continue working on this illustration, doing the what I call the final polishing phase. I don't know how polished this illustration is going to get, but I'm moving in with a little marker. Last week I did exclusively watercolors. And it's a little unusual for me, actually, to add a marker to watercolors, but I wanted to sort of darken up this grass area a little bit because I'm hoping to do some opaque gouache-based work on the foliage a little later on. And as I've been doing with all of these videos, I'm talking about influences, people who have influenced me as a creative person, as an artist. In the case of David Small, influenced me sort of face-to-face as someone that I knew in real life back when I was in college. These guys I'm about to talk about, I definitely didn't know in real life. It's the Beatles. I decided to sort of throw things off a little in terms of what you might expect me to talk about in a video like this. I'm an artist. I've talked mainly about art or animators, and this time I thought, why not talk about these musicians, the Beatles, that had a very formative influence on me, and show that, as a creative person, your influences don't only come from people who are doing the same thing or a similar thing to what you're doing. You can get an influence from almost anywhere. And to tell you the truth, I could just have easily talked about Monty Python, which was a big influence on me, but for some reason I decided I feel like I've never really talked about the Beatles over the course of all these different videos that I've done, at least certainly not at length. And if you hate the Beatles, you'll probably be glad that I never talked about them. But hopefully some of you love the Beatles. And in any case, it should be interesting to hear about how does this relate to me as an artist. And I think the main thing about the Beatles that is an influence on me, well, let me begin actually by talking about how young I was when I first encountered the music of the Beatles. And I still have this sort of foggy memory of childhood when my brothers and I have two older brothers, and my parents were invited over to a friend's house, and this guy, this would have been in the early 70s, mid-70s at the latest, had a copy of the Beatles' second album, which in America was called Meet the Beatles. And those of you who know that album, know that period of time, that was really the sort of Beatlemania album. That was when they had that classic, highly energetic, poppy sound that made them so famous. The album did not include songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand or She Loves You, but the album very much was building on that sound. And I still have memories, and I would have been only like 8 or 9 years old or something, of all of us just dancing around to this music and loving it. Every song on that album, it just filled us with energy. As I think their music did for the people back in the 60s. There was this energy, this unmistakable energy, enthusiasm in their sound that no one else at that time had delivered in quite the same way, and I think that's a big part of why they initially had such big success, that energy. But I don't want to talk so much about how the music influenced me as to talk about how can musicians influence a visual artist like me. And I think the biggest way that the Beatles influenced me in that regard is the fact that they never settled on a single sound, and they were always challenging themselves to try something new and to move on to some new style. Certainly once they got past their first few albums, you can hear them drastically changing their sound. And I think that's when the Beatles really become interesting to me and to a lot of people, is when you get to that middle period, when they start to kind of show the world, you know what, we can do almost any kind of song we want to. Even as early as a song like Yesterday, which, it's hard to hear that with fresh ears now because we've all heard it a million times, but that was a rather startling song for the Beatles to deliver with this string quartet and so forth in the background. Even the other Beatles, it was a Paul McCartney song really mostly. Even the other Beatles were sort of like, should we release this? Because this is not what people are expecting from the Beatles, Paul and George Martin said, well, yeah, we should definitely release this. But they didn't release it as a single in England. The other Beatles vetoed that idea. It was, of course, was released as a single in America and shot straight to #1. Anyway, I shouldn't go on at length about that, but even at that early stage in their career, they were trying new things. They were challenging themselves to do a different sound and to almost shock everybody with like, see, we don't only do the She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah. We're going to do almost anything we feel like doing, and we're going to try to do it well no matter what it is that we do. And eventually I think they were sort of like, we're going to show you we do it all. You cannot predict the next thing that the Beatles are going to do. And I think that sort of approach became very much influential on me insofar as I have tried almost to my own damage. I have tried always to start fresh with each new project that I do and always be taking on some new challenge of some type of story that I've never done before. So, I started with this children's story, all ages story, called Akiko on the planet Smoo. And I suppose the closest I came to repeating myself was when I did this follow-up story called Billy Click, which really did not reach a very wide audience. But after that, I really started branching out, and I did Miki Falls, which was a love story. A straight-up romantic love story. Probably not what anyone would have thought I was going to do, and I did it in this manga style, a style I had never really worked in up until that point. And I sort of reveled in the fact of, wow, I'm reinventing myself completely with this latest project. And I completely threw myself into that, and I did not shy away from the love story aspect of it. There's a farewell at a train station scene. I was like deliberately saying, let's take this old chestnut of the goodbye at the railway tracks and see if I can do it my way. What happens when Mark Crilly tries to do a love story? A supernatural love story. It's not just purely a straightforward love story. But in any case, suffice to say, my feeling was that I wanted to try something new and not just keep doing what people had come to expect from me. And I do think that a lot of that came from the example of the Beatles. Now, another thing that I wanted to talk about with the Beatles, and I think it's if you know about the members of the band, you will know that Paul McCartney was the sort of more accessible between the two main guys of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney, especially as time went on, he was delivering these sometimes very jaunty tunes that, Obla Di Obla Da and stuff like that everyone could sing along with, and you were never, challenged too much by what was going on in the song. But John Lennon started heading off and doing really strange things, like I'm the Walrus and so forth. And I just love the fact that the band had these two different strains of accessibility versus sort of, I guess, artsiness, for lack of a better word. And I suppose I fall more on the side of the Paul McCartney side of things in terms of wanting my work to always be very accessible. But then there's always that nagging feeling that maybe came from John Lennon. It's like, shouldn't you be doing something a little weirder, a little more challenging, a little more daring, something that no one has seen before? And so that's always sort of in the back of my mind. Time to add the blushies, guys. I know I usually wait till the end. But sometimes the blushies need to come forth. So yeah, in a funny way, that whole attitude towards being innovative versus remaining accessible, and I want to be clear because some of you maybe really do know the Beatles. I do not mean to say that Paul McCartney was not an innovator. Far from it. He did a lot of daring stuff as well. I mean, listen to the White Album. The first truly bizarre song on the album comes from Paul McCartney. I think it's called Wild Honey Pie. And anyone who loved the Beatles, when they first heard that, they must have just been like, what? What are these guys doing? It almost sounds like an attempt to create a terrible song on purpose, to throw everyone off. It's not a terrible song, but it just does not sound like what we expect from the Beatles. And it's hard to believe that one came from Paul. But that whole, the tension between the sort of what I would call the people-pleasing artist and the more daring rebel artist is one of the interesting things at the heart of the Beatles. And I'm working on a new story right now. Haven't talked about it very much, and I can't talk about it too much today, but I'm working on a new graphic novel that is a little bit based on that idea, this tension between the people-pleasing type of artist, the one who has that sort of instinct, the more cautious and the more daring artist. And so in a way, I have reached a point where the sort of the real-life story of the Beatles has influenced one particular project that I'm working on. In a light way. My project is not about musicians, it's about artists. But I've always been sort of fascinated by the fact that artists can have completely different temperaments and different ideas of what art ought to be. And even as I look back on the people that I've talked about so far, as influences, I would say that Brad Bird is maybe a good example of the people-pleasing, accessible artist. There's nothing in Ratatouille that is going to throw you for a loop and have you saying, what is this even about? It's not that kind of a story. But it's great. And so, yeah, all of this stuff has come into play with me in terms of choosing what type of artist am I going to be. Am I ever going to be the weirdo artist that does something daring and unpredictable, like I Am the Walrus, or Strawberry Fields, or A Day in the Life when the orchestra starts building and going up and up and up. I mean, that's even today, that is very daring music. It sounds surprising even now, all these years later. So that's kind of my little spiel about how musicians can influence artists. Artists can, of course, influence musicians, and I wanted to make sure that I got at least one example in here of, non-visual art to show you that your influences can be far-flung, and I would say in a way that you should seek out influences that are wide-ranging. Sometimes it can be a little dangerous to get all your influences from one source. Like if you fall in love with manga and all you're looking at is manga, you may be sort of hampering yourself if that's your only source of influence. I just chose that as an example. I don't mean, it could be true of anything. If you're a musician and you only listen to one type of music, then I think you're probably limiting yourself. Whereas if you get a few more different influences in there, it just deepens what you're doing. And I'm afraid that brings me to the end of this fourth and final video. I really want to thank all of you who stuck with it. I know if you're used to seeing something new every week, it's maybe a little challenging. Like, oh man, is he still working on that illustration? But it does give me the chance to show people real time How long does it take Curly to do one of these illustrations? In this case, an hour. I did about 15 minutes 4 times. I think it is helpful for people to see the reality, and rather than having me hide behind old man time-lapse every time. In any case, I'll be getting back to my more normal traditional videos in the weeks ahead, but I do want to thank you all for watching this one. Hang on, I'm going to go ahead and grab my books so that I can say thank you to anyone who has supported me by getting them, like the Realism Challenge, my book on hyper-realistic illustration, and manga art. This book, in a funny way, is kind of my White Album. You know, the Beatles' White Album has this wide-ranging style to it, and manga art is the same way. I try to challenge myself to do so many different types of illustrations that you almost wouldn't think they were all by the same guy. But they were. I swear. But I think it is time for me, finally, to lay down this brush. I want to thank you all for watching this video, and indeed for watching the previous ones. If you watched all 4, my hat's off especially to all of you. But let's go ahead and wind this one down. I want to thank you all for watching it. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.